Firstly, let's get your initial reaction to the report.
Well, I think a lot of these points were already in the pipeline. We know about the ANC's national conference resolution that was taken in 2017. We know about the parliamentary resolution that was taken. Then the parliamentary committee chaired by Dr. Dudisa. Ms. Dr. Dudisa is now the Minister of Agriculture, who went quite a distance with the formulation of an amendment. And now the resumption of that. So I think all of this all goes into one direction, and that is also the conclusion that was reached by this panel now.
Now, much has also been said about expropriation without compensation. Let's start there. Let's have a look at the initial reactions that we've seen to the recommendations around that, pertaining to the conditions that come with it.
Yes, I think there's obviously various reactions, and they are also not new reactions. We know about the DA that was very critical of the notion of expropriation without compensation. The Freedom Front Plus the same. None of the political parties actually changed their position in response to this panel report. When it comes to Agri-SA, I think their position was also known. The fact that their president served on this panel meant that they had the direct input into the finding of it, and he submitted the supplementary report that articulates, therefore, directly what Agri-SA's position is. So I think what we have now is a very clear landscape about what are the positions or the opinions of the different role players.
And what do you make of the FF Plus stating that this would now essentially be putting us on the same path as Zimbabwe?
Well, again, this is something which they, for example, in the election now, the national and provincial election, and in their election manifesto, they made that statement then already. So it is, again, it is a known position, and it is something which for them, obviously, is something that they are arguing against. It is part of their constituency, of many persons involved in the agricultural sector. And I think what they want to do is to say, well, we want to protect their interests. So again, it is very much clear where the different positions are, very much informed by their supporters and by the interests that they represent.
Just earlier we heard from Professor Ruth Hall pertaining to the current provisions within Section 25, but how are these recommendations going to be different from the current Section 25 in the Constitution as it stands, which already allows in some instances for expropriation without compensation?
I think there's no differences of opinion about that statement that the current formulation of the Constitution already allows for expropriation without compensation. I personally don't see it in the Constitution. I think in order to have that possible, the Constitution will have to be amended. And I think what we've seen with especially the parliamentary committee chaired by Ms. Dudisa, which dealt specifically with the amendment, is that there's still a lot of debate that's necessary and required. I think back, for example, to the submission made by Judge Albie Sachs about what are the different options that can be chosen from in order to make an amendment, even if the decision about amendment has been taken. But what form is it? Is it an extensive amendment? Is it just a very broad amendment? Does it require some additional legislation? How the expropriation bill or act ultimately will have to be changed in this respect? So there's a lot of work that has to be done, even if the point of departure is that the Constitution has to be amended.
Now, in terms of the other play factors in here, there's also been talk of huge amounts of corruption with regards to land as well as the title deeds around that.
Yes, I'm not the expert in that field, so I can't really go into exactly what is the extent of that. I think there's other people who are much better qualified than me to speak about that. I think what we have seen is that a lot of money has been spent on the land reform, especially land restitution and land redistribution. And as we know, the outputs, the result of this program, and it started in the middle 1990s already, that restitution process, for example, closed already in 1998. And still some of the cases are or some of the claims are outstanding. So there's many questions about what happened, why is it taking so much time, what happened with the money also, and whether the money, the budgets that were available were actually spent for the purpose that they were meant for. We know that we've come through a period of corruption on a widespread basis in both the private and the public sector. So I guess many people will argue that it also applies to the land reform process.
Now, upon the release of the report, there's been a lot of talk on what political parties per se disagree with, and what they don't hold consensus is, also pertaining to the fact that this was not a unanimous decision. But we did also then hear from Agri SA Dun Creek saying that as much as they brought forward their minority report review on this land panel report, there are some instances and recommendations in which they are supportive of. So in your view, can you take us through both the good and the bad in the report?
Well, I think the report is talking over and above the expropriation component, which I think is the controversial part of it. The other parts of the land reform process and how to restructure agriculture in general, that is supported, and as we heard earlier on from the president of Agri SA, they do support these recommendations, and how to make this South African agriculture more competitive in terms of the global perspective, how to make sure that there's going to be food security in South Africa for the long-term future, how to deal also with aspects of water, for example. We are a water-scarce country, and agriculture is the biggest consumer of water in South Africa. So that's going to become quite a critical factor of how to plan for the future under those conditions. Climate change is obviously another factor that has received attention, and that is something where I think there's a lot of support from the different stakeholders, how to approach that.
Now, Professor, have you been able, or rather can you comment on some of the administrative views and changes that we could be seeing in this land reform process, particularly to possibly the land bank?
Well, I haven't seen the report yet. I was actually not so well prepared for this interview, and therefore it's impossible, unfortunately, to comment on that.
Can I then ask you on the comments made by Agri SA with regards to the change, particularly in legislation of Section 25, saying that this seems to be a political matter?
Well, anything that goes through Parliament has a political component. There's nothing which is completely apolitical. This is a matter which is also different political parties and other stakeholders or other role players in South Africa. They have their own views. They have their own positions on this. Many of them are informed about the interests that they represent, and that's per definition what politics is about. It's about contestation, it's about interaction, it's about negotiations between different interest groups, which include political parties, in order to come to a point where a decision is taken which is then becomes known as public policy. And I think this is one of the processes that we are seeing unfolding before us.
Just very briefly, Professor, your views on the Ingonyama Trust Act being brought to be reviewed or reappealed as a recommendation?
Well, this is one of the most controversial parts of land reform. It's sometimes not taken into account, and we can recall that there was a time after the announcement of the decision or the resolution about expropriation without compensation, that the Ingonyama and the Zulu monarchy was saying, well, if that is the case, that it will mean that that can be also expropriated, we won't be part of it, we won't support it. So the Ingonyama Trust is going very far back, and this is something which is intimately associated with traditional authority in South Africa. It's not only about KwaZulu-Natal, it affects also communal lands and other trusts, because this is not the only trust in South Africa. And I think, therefore, the government will be exceptionally cautious before they move on this.
Thank you very much for your time this evening, political analyst Professor Dirk Kotze, as we unpack the Land Panel Review report that was released today.